when I was hired, the partners of the firm knew the law was expiring and they wanted me to concentrate in that area. And that's what happened. The law expired.
Yo, what is up, everybody? My name is Matt Drouin. I'm the host of the Go Big Live Real Estate Investors Podcast, the show to listen to if you are an experienced real estate investor, residential, that owns maybe a couple duplexes, a couple triplexes, and wants to scale up into doing larger commercial real estate deals and also redevelopment and development deals. A lot of us think about attorneys in the transaction space when it comes to deals, right? Closing attorneys is what we call them, right? And really, when it comes to the commercial real estate space, attorneys play a crucial role in helping you perform all the other types of functions, from land use to entitlements to tax incentives, to putting together the capital stack on these deals that have a lot of moving parts. They are an incredible member of your team when you are putting together deals, and you may not be able to use your old residential real estate attorney again while you're scaling. So I brought a special guest on that I'm psyched out of my mind. A friend of mine, Mr. Alvin Schein. He's partnered with Seiden Schein in New York City. We've known each other for many years. Their practice is limited to real estate law. They've been practicing in New York City for over 35 years. And I want to stop there for a second, because we always talk about leverage used in real estate as in bank leverage and debt, right? I think the greatest single most powerful form of leverage in real estate is leveraging other people's expertise. So this is how I've been able to scale my business, be successful, is by hiring smart guys like Alvin. And he represents clients and connections with all aspects of real estate development, including site acquisition and financing, inclusionary and other affordable housing, purchase and sale of development rights, real estate tax incentives, as well as condominium and cooperative offering plans. The agenda for this show is we're going to talk about Alvin's background, and also asking questions about, like, when do you need a specialized attorney to help you while you're scaling, how to select one, what are some policy initiatives that we can support, especially in New York State, to address our affordable housing crisis that we have, that might have some applicability for all of you across on other coasts that listen to this show, and then also free money, right? There's some programs out there that can help subsidize our capital stack in order to provide new housing to our market that's desperately needed for our residents across New York State. So long-winded intro, Alvin, but I'm thankful for you coming on the show.
Thank you. Great intro, Matt.
Well, excellent. All right, so first question. You're born, now you're here. What happened in between?
Oh, quite a bit. But I don't think we have to go back into my childhood. We can skip the part and start with legal practice. I started out as a general real estate attorney. That is just contracts and closings, things like that. It's certainly an important skill. You need, not everybody can do a good contract, especially there are problem situations. But there are a lot of contract lawyers out there. I was hired a couple of years out of law school, actually, to start in a specialty area, which was co-op and condo conversions. At that time, there was a moratorium on co-op and condo conversions. It was called the Goodman-Deary law, and you just could not do it at all. When I was hired, the partners of the firm knew the law was expiring, and they wanted me to concentrate in that area. And that's what happened. The law expired, and there was a pent-up demand by owners with unprofitable buildings. That is, they were subject to rent stabilization, rent control, and there was no way out. The rents were very low, in the area of, say, $300, $350 a month. There was no profit margin, and buildings could be losing money. And there was no way out of rent stabilization or rent control. However, doing a conversion was the exit strategy, where you could offer the apartments to the tenants at a big discount, like 50% of market value. This was phenomenally successful. We did a lot of offering plans, sold many, many units, and this became the source of wealth for many people in the 80s, 1980s, and even the 1990s of converting buildings, where because there were tenants, regulated tenants, they were able to buy an apartment at a big discount, live there if they want, or sell it and take the money and go buy a house or go buy a brownstone. And many thousands of people did that. So it helped everybody. It helped the owners of unprofitable buildings, and it helped the tenants to own something and realize on that ownership. That process was ended by the 2019 rent laws, where the way it was ended was that the state required that in order to convert a building, you had to sell to 51% of the tenants in occupancy at that time, which is impossible. That used to be a standard for what was called an eviction plan, which nobody ever did. Nobody ever did an eviction plan. All conversions were non-eviction plans, meaning if you could buy or not buy. If you didn't buy, you stayed on as a regulated tenant. But so the 51% buy rule was taken out of the eviction standard, which nobody ever did, and put into the non-eviction standard, which made non-eviction impossible. To me, I think that's a wrong thing to do by the state legislature. I think that there are many landlords now who are hurting because of the 2019 rent laws that really cap the amount of money you can get on making improvements. Yes, recently that the caps were increased slightly, but it's just shown by the evidence that sale of multifamily buildings that have rent regulation, the values have plummeted, like 20, 30, 40% drops in value. People may say, why do I care? I don't care about the owner losing money. Well, the banks care. That's for sure. A lot of foreclosures in that area. But the other side is that tenants could have done well if the owner was able to convert the building. At 51%, you can never get enough people to buy at any kind of reasonable price. So that's not going to happen. It hasn't happened since the law was passed 5 years ago, almost 5 years ago. There have been no conversions. So that market is dead. I would hope that in the interest of doing good for the large and recognizing that tenants would get a benefit from it, I would hope the legislature might reverse some of that and say drop it down to say 15% of tenants buying, which is higher than it was in the past, which was 15% of anybody buying who said who represented they were going to live in the building. But if they get it down to 15% of tenants, I think that might work, and I think we might have successful conversions, which I think would help everybody. Then years later, I had a client who was very interested in what's called inclusionary air rights, specifically off-site inclusionary air rights. The idea was that if you built an affordable building, you could get certificates from the city that enabled a market rate developer, like a condo developer, to get a zoning bonus for their building that they're going to build as a condo. So this was a business where an affordable developer would find a site, get financing for it. We'd file with HPD to get a regulatory agreement, and then market the certificates. This was an entirely new area. I knew nothing about it initially. The client who hired me didn't know much more than I did, except he knew it was a good business. And I said, "You really want to use me on this? I don't know anything about this subject." And he said, "You're a smart guy. You'll figure it out." And that's what happened. We worked on the first deal, then there was second deal, third deal, fourth deal. Other clients knew I was doing this work, and suddenly, you're the go-to guy in that area. So this has happened several times during my career, where you just get into an area not realizing where it's taking you, but it turns out to be a good direction and something which produces value and produces housing, which is really what it's all about, is to produce housing where we all know there's not enough housing. One of my goals at this stage in my career is concentrating on housing that people can afford. I mean, we know that there's plenty of luxury housing out there. That's what's being built, but very little mid-market and very little very little mid-market, very little mid-market rental, very little mid-market co-op or condo, very little mid-market housing. That's what we need. All subsidies are concentrated towards those who need it the most. Unquestionably, the lowest income rungs need housing subsidies the most. I'm not arguing with that, but there are out-of-the-box methods that local municipalities can use to spark the creation of additional housing. One of them, it would be accessory dwelling units, meaning building another unit on the same lot that you have a one-family house. It could be within the house. It could be a garage. It could be in the basement, possibly even a new structure in the backyard. The problem is zoning, building code, septic systems. These are all issues, but they can all be dealt with. And I think if towns really looked at allowing or permitting accessory dwelling units to be built, it would go a long way in helping provide housing for people. In the town that I live in, Long Island, it's just not happening. A lot of talk and very, very little action in terms of accessory dwelling units, which is too bad.
Alan, let's stop there for a moment, because I mean, there's this phenomena that's happening with, you alluded to it. There's this sort of divergence to the both like kind of opposite ends of the extreme, where luxury housing and then also, deeply affordable housing. And we're having this sort of hollowing out in the middle. But at the same time, we have this phenomena where, this is happening across metropolitan areas across the United States, is, companies downsizing and not needing as much office footprint. So we have this opportunity, for instance, to maybe address the middle housing income from ownership outcomes or even rental outcomes. We were talking yesterday in the show prep on this programs that can be accretive to that happening. So what is out there in terms of resources that can help subsidize the capital stack in this really high cost, hard costs, soft costs are through the roof. I can't believe when I'm looking at, quotes on redevelopment costs for projects, I'm like, how the heck are we going to afford to do this? Because we're not benevolent billionaires that have unlimited amount of cash within which to burn. So what do you say to that?
So there's a lot less available now than there used to be. There used to be what was known as the Mitchell-Lama program, which subsidized a lot of middle-income housing, both rental and co-op. That's not here anymore. Governor Hochul talked about Mitchell-Lama 2.0, but that's mostly really talk. There's no real funding of that right now. But there is one state program called AHOP, which is an affordable housing program through HCR. And a developer can get $200,000 for a two-bedroom apartment and $150,000 for a one-bedroom apartment to be sold in the market, which kind of helps. That may or may not be enough, depending on land prices. It's possible if by working with the town might have land to throw into the deal or to sell at a below market price. I think that's a really good program that's not really being utilized enough. I'm not sure if the state has enough money allocated to AHOP to make it happen. In my discussions with developers who are doing it, if they know an AHOP job is planned for one community, they won't go into that community until that job is finished, because they're concerned that HCR won't fund the second one in the same community. So it takes a little bit of flexibility to find the site. But that is the only real program right now in the state that would subsidize new construction, middle income, affordable housing. Those that have been built have been phenomenally successful. They have long waiting lists on resale, and in speaking to local people love the whole concept. I think I mentioned to you, I was speaking to a local person in Southold whose son, who's married and has a baby, was able to buy a resale of an AHOP condominium, and they're thrilled. They said if it wasn't, they weren't able to buy this, the son would have moved out of state. North Carolina, South Carolina would have been lost, and the family would have been split apart. These are programs that we need. And I think with some creative thinking, the programs can be enhanced with perhaps help from municipalities. As I said, subsidized land, it could work. And you could have homes for sale, say in the $300,000 range, which would be affordable. With, of course, resale restrictions. But in other words, you're not going to buy it for $300,000 and then resell it for $1 million. But the way the program is structured, you do build equity by mortgage amortization, and the program does allow increased sale amounts pretty much based on inflation. So it's a phenomenal product if it's funded enough and there is available land for it. So I would definitely like to see more of that.
Yeah, it's been a program that's kind of we've stuck a pin in. We're in the process and we're pre-development right now on the Wilder Building in 17 East Main Street in downtown Rochester, and the city wants to see more home ownership. Right, it's been difficult in a Rust Belt city like Rochester because our single family home prices have definitely appreciated a lot. They're certainly not like the likes of, in the 5 boroughs and other areas of downstate, but, it's like, okay, we're going to have a $300,000 2-bedroom condo, for instance, that would be in this historic building here. Well, I can buy a $350,000, single family house with a yard and that sort of thing. So there's definitely been a low adoption rate for it. So we're a little bit concerned on, okay, well, if we do this, convert a certain amount of the floor plates to condos and then utilize the AHAP program, like, what if there's no buyer on the back end through this? Is there a provision where, okay, do you get the subsidy even if you convert it to a rental, and that sort of thing is a kind of a big risk in areas outside of New York City. Plus, there's the other complexity that we're going to have to rely on historic tax credits for this project as well, and so we have questions about. All right. Well, what's the compliance for the there's a master lease agreement that's going to be needed with the actual tax credit equity investor, and how does that parlay and dovetail with condos, for instance?
Well, it doesn't. Tax credits don't work with condos. That's only going to work with the rental, because the tax credits are obtained over a 10-year period. You have to keep ownership, so it's just not going to work on a for sale product. The money's not there for based on low-income housing tax credits. But you're raising an interesting point that if the price level is not much different than market, then how is it going to work? The only other way would be to get more funding from the municipality to add on to what the state is providing. If you could bring it in at $250 or $200, then you're going to sell it. But you need to have a sizable gap between market. In eastern Long Island, on the North Fork, the median home price was over $1 million last year, and at $1 million, it's a house that needs a lot of work. So if you can bring in an AHOP unit at $300,000, people will be lining up for that because there's just no product like that available. There's a problem with land prices. How do you make it affordable? I mean, from the other end, because of the high land prices, how do you bring it in so that as a developer you can at least make a modest profit and sell it? In cases where I've seen it happen, usually the land would be contributed by the town, and then you get the state subsidy of $150 or $200, and then therefore the gap of construction costs can be covered by the developer. But I see the problem you're raising, but downstate, I don't think that's an issue.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, let's talk about the compliance. It sounds like there's some compliance tails on the AHOP program with. All right, so are you restricted to who you can sell the original unit to in terms of being a percentage of area median income, or is it anybody who has the can stroke a check for what the highest bidder and that sort of thing?
Right.
Tell me about
So
that.
it's the AHOP program is designed to be sold between 80% AMI and 100% AMI. You have to fall in that AMI gap in order to be able to buy. If you're at 60% AMI, you're not going to buy, and if you're 120, you're not going to buy. So that's kind of a problem with all affordable housing deals, that you have a narrow gap of who you can sell to. It could be designed to be a little more flexible, where it could go from, you can't go much lower than 80, because when you're going lower than 80, there's just not enough housing money available even to carry the property. We tried it in the city at 60% AMI, and it was just very difficult. You wind up having to almost give the unit away at that price, at a loss. But if the income range was, say, 80 to 120, I think that would work a lot better. Maybe a little less subsidy on the high end. Try to average it in. But right now we're talking about 80 to 100, which is kind of restricted.
Yeah, it's definitely a narrow band. On that note, one of the things I was curious about in talking to you today as well was on this sort of siloed approach on luxury, affordable. A lot of municipalities, the buzzwords have been mixed income communities. Are there any examples or programs that are currently in place or case studies in which people are actually creating mixed income communities? Because in Rochester and Buffalo and Syracuse, for instance, it's like one or the other. There's really nothing that's in between. And I get it from a long-term systemic standpoint that you don't want to have low income building, low income area that has a bunch of low income people siloed, because it's very, very difficult to break generational problems when you have that. And same thing goes for luxury as well. So what do you have to say about mixed income?
So the experience in New York City is somewhat different in that zoning has been engineered to really force a combination of low income and high income in the same rental building. And that vehicle occurs through inclusionary housing. It occurs through real estate tax benefits, where if you want the program, that's the deal. It's generally going to be 75% market and 25% affordable. And the affordability range it's varied over time depending on the program, but the range can be usually between 40 and 80% of AMI on the affordable side. And it's worked out pretty well, actually. There have been incidents, but the incidents had to do more with poor management on the city side, because of sending really people as tenants who really need social services. And that's what can mess up a project. If someone is not capable of independent living as a working person, then that could be a problem. What I'm saying is very politically unpopular, and I may be criticized for this, because you're not supposed to be critical of providing housing for people who need social services. I would say that the people in that category should not be in mixed income housing. They should be in separate supportive housing accommodations. But we had some issues where there was poor management by the city, and a person who needed supervision was given an apartment and created issues. But for the most part, it's phenomenally successful. The tenants don't necessarily even know who's a low-income tenant and who's not. And it works because what does a developer get out of it? It usually gets a zoning bonus, gets to build more housing. Sometimes you have to. In some areas, you have what's called mandatory inclusionary, where an area has been upzoned, and if you're going to build anything, you have to provide affordable housing if you're going to be building market rate. So I was a little skeptical when these programs first started, but I'm a fan of it. The problem is that it's not conducive to home ownership, because you can't have a market rate condo and have buyers who have an average AMI of 60% AMI, because they can't qualify. It's usually you can't qualify for very much money at 60% AMI. It's just not going to work. Even if you're going to sell the unit at a steep discount, there's just not enough cash flow available to pay housing expenses and any kind of a mortgage. So that has put it's disadvantageous to those who want to develop condos. But for rental housing, it works very well. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, there's in Rochester, I know that there's a couple of modalities of pilot programs or tax incentives from the real estate side of things, where we have 485A, or it's also nicknamed the Q in downtown Rochester, and they require it in order to get that generous tax rate, you have to provide 20% units at 60% AMI. And sometimes it's not a no-brainer up front. You got to do a certain amount of calculus in it. And that, if we're renting units below market rate to comply with that, are we getting our valuation in the back end? Because it's a big risk when you're going through assuming development and construction risk and change orders that are prevalent with renovating historic properties, historic office properties, that you could be left, with a lot of equity, as they say, in the deal, a lot of unplanned equity in the deal at the back end. We were talking about seniors, okay, and senior housing in the green room before we hit the record button. I'm definitely passionate about this issue. And I don't know what the demographics look like across the state and across the country, but I was on the mayor's housing quality task force just recently with a focus on home ownership, and the statistics were just startling. Over 60% of the homeowners in the city of Rochester. Now, we're a 60-40 city. We're 60% are renters, 40% are homeowners, and we have the worst outcomes from a homeownership standpoint in the state. And 60% of homeowners are like 60 years or older. All right. And these are 1930s built, two-story houses that are expensive to maintain and also are in 2 stories. So we're talking about ways in which to have housing options that are going to help our seniors as well. So let's talk about that.
Sure. So I was reading about this recently, and in New York State, the population is aging very rapidly. Every year, the median age keeps moving up. I'm at the tail end of the baby boomer generation, where all these babies were born after World War II and getting older and older. So it's an issue. You have multiple problems. You have seniors living in large homes with no place necessarily to go that they want to go to. Not everybody wants to go to Florida. And it would be better if they moved to a smaller accommodation and put the house in the market. It would help the housing market, because there's a shortage of houses in many places. So, and the state really has not gotten involved in this too much at all. New York City had a program where you would get a zoning bonus if you built senior housing in a mixed-use development. That is market rate, and say like 80-20, 80% general population market, 20% senior. It was very successful. We did a lot of that work, but for political reasons, there was an issue between those who wanted general population affordable and senior housing, and for political reasons, the city, or HPD, ended its privately financed senior program, which to me was a big loss. We did a building in Chelsea that was unbelievably beautiful, market rate, very high rents. The market rate apartments actually rented much higher than were projected, like over $100 a square foot of rent. But the rent for the seniors, these were the same apartments same finishes, and the rents were at not higher than 80% AMI. So at 80% AMI, it was a phenomenal deal for seniors. People loved it. People in the community board asked me, like, why are your clients not doing more of this housing? The answer is the city ended the program for political reasons. So that was the end of that, which I thought was very unfortunate. There needs to be more focus on affordable senior housing. The easiest way to do it is within mixed income. That is, percentage of the building, market rate general, and a percentage senior, rather than 100% senior, which can be done. There are subsidized senior programs that are 100% senior, phenomenally expensive. In New York City, it's called the SARA program, and is extremely, extremely expensive because it's coupled with project-based Section 8 in most cases. And when we have project-based Section 8, you're subject to the Bacon-Davis rules on employment wages, which are extremely high, raise the cost of the job. So the subsidy needed is just huge. To me, I don't see that as a widespread method of affordable housing. There's just not enough low-income housing tax credit money for that, and there's just not enough Section 8 money for that. And yes, there is a poor or low-income aging population that needs to be taken care of, but you also need to address the middle-income housing population, for which there are not too many alternatives. There is expensive senior housing available, but many people can't afford that. So I think this is something that I think the state really needs to focus on, which it is not focusing on at all. Any focus on that area is only being done by municipalities on a spot basis.
So Alvin, I'm not sure if you agree with me, but I'm come from the school of thought that all new housing is good housing, because of the enormous amount of hurdles that market rate and affordable housing developments are. So, challenge me on that if you don't think that that's true. But also, in terms of actionable types of things that people can do, because there's people who live all across New York State, in metropolitan areas and in small towns. And every area struggles with affordable housing. We were talking in the green room about ADUs and a provision or opt-in provision within the New York State statute on some incentives that your town has to opt into. And what I'm alluding to is is this something that people can advocate for in their small towns in order to get this additional benefit? And kind of tell us about that statute in greater detail.
So yes, this is something I think local civic groups should be bringing this up. It's just not talked enough about. I think every community probably has a luxury senior development. I see these all over the state, but they're just not enough for middle income and low income people across the state. And the population is growing older. So I think that this should be an area of local concern, local politics. You need to talk about it.
And then, Alvin, what is do you remember what the name of the actual statute is, so that people have something to reference when they're advocating for? Because there's some small towns where there might be local town council officials that aren't even familiar with this even being in existence. And from what you're telling me is that there's a big an ADU can be expensive to build, and sometimes and how that can be subsidized and have the behavior for a homeowner to make that decision to do so is that through a special tax incentive of, I believe what it was 10 years that
Yes.
they wouldn't have to pay real estate taxes on this additional improvement. So is there a statute that people out there can reference to bring
Yes.
their attention to town council?
So what happened about a year and a half ago, the state legislature actually passed a series of tax exemption statutes they're all prefixed by 421A, which actually not 421A. They start with 421 and then have letters after them, like 421D, E, etc. I don't recall exactly which is which at the moment, but there is a statute that permits the municipality to exempt any increases in real estate taxes on an ADU for a 10-year period, but that only happens if the municipality adopts the state legislation. The state didn't force it on municipalities, they made it optional. So if a town wants to encourage ADU creation, they should adopt that state statute. There's also 3 other 421 statutes that apply to 100% affordable, and there's one for mixed income. So there are actually 3 different 421 statutes, and it's not an A. I don't want to get confused. 421A was an exemption program in New York City that expired. But these are new 421 statutes that provide exemptions in 3 different situations, either ADUs, 100% affordable, or mixed income. And in all cases, they have to be adopted by the local municipality in order to be effective.
Absolutely, yeah. So I'm always advocating to getting to know your town council, city council members, because the presidential election is the Super Bowl of elections. But I think that people have neglect to really understand that they do have power and they do have a voice within which to communicate issues relating to housing, and can effectuate housing policy in a positive direction in their own towns. So, Alvin, you've been generous with your time. Last question I want to ask you is, our listeners out there, they've used a real estate transaction attorney. When do they need to look into having a different member of their team when they're getting into more complex types of things? And then what is the best way to select the best legal practitioner when they're getting into more complicated commercial real estate deals like you do?
So look, it's a good question, and it's a difficult question to answer. All I'm going to say is that if the deal is more complicated than buying it and financing it, you need a specialist. If you're going to get involved in any city or state programs, you need a lawyer who understands the programs. A general practitioner who may be great at buying and selling is unlikely to know state and city programs. How to find an attorney, I guess if you speak to other developers, you'll probably ask them what counsel they use. I think that'll probably be the best way, by word of mouth. But certainly, depending on where you live or where you're building, the levels of complexity may differ. Certainly downstate, every town has their own program. Zoning is very complicated, and you just need people who work in that area to help you navigate the process.
Absolutely. Alvin, how do our listeners get best in touch with you and how they can connect and further the conversation?
You should check our website out, our podcast out. We have a terrific podcast, and I think you would enjoy the discussions. We have a lot of interesting people in real estate, both developers, lawyers, civic people, and we have a catalog of podcasts we've done.
Absolutely. We'll be sure to put the link to both of those in the show notes for the episode. Alvin, thank you so much for coming on and being generous with your time.
Thank you.